Thank you for joining us for this podcast from Atlee Church. Atlee is a safe place for those who gave up on church or never went. Our mission is to reach seekers and equip believers to love God, love themselves, love others, and serve the world. We would love for you to join us for one of our live services across any of our campuses, both physical and online. You can find service times and locations on our website, as well as information about small groups and where to volunteer. We hope that you will be both encouraged and challenged to take the next step in your personal faith journey through the message you are about to hear.
All right, you guys ready to jump in this morning? Really? All right, on the count of three, I want everybody to say jump in. Ready? 1, 2, 3. All right, I'm glad. Let's jump in. So as we start today, I'm going to give you a statement, and I want you to think about how you would fill this statement in, how you'd fill in the blank. If it were not for fear, I would, and think about how you would finish that statement. If it were not for fear, I would. And you know what that might be. Now, as you're thinking about that, let me just take a moment and welcome everyone to all of our campuses, especially Scottsville, as they're tuning in right now with us. Northside, been with us all morning online. Glad you guys are here. And here in Mechanicsville, always glad that you guys are here and part of the weekend experience with us. So we're continuing in a series that we've started several weeks ago now called Exchange. And this series was inspired by a single verse in the Bible. It's Romans chapter 1, verse 25 that says this: they exchanged the truth. Everybody say truth. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie. So we've been looking at these different lies that we've bought into, and maybe we didn't even realize they were lies, but regardless, we bought into them, and they're robbing us of God's grace, God's truth, and especially God's power in our life. And that's especially true with today's lie. Here's today's lie that we're looking at. God can't use me unless I'm spiritually strong. God cannot use me unless I'm spiritually strong. Now, all of us have probably said this at one time or another. You know, we look at it and we think, well, you know, and even in light of that statement, you know, God can't use me because I'm not spiritually strong enough. But when I look at this statement, and I love to tear things like this apart, you know, I think of this phrase, spiritually strong. What does it look like to be spiritually strong? What does it mean to be spiritually strong? I mean, how would you measure that? What would you measure that against to determine if you're spiritually strong or not? You know, when I look at this lie, I think there's more to it than it just being a lie. I think what's really behind this statement is an excuse. I really do. I think it's more about an excuse that we make for not doing what we know that God has asked us to do. And we've all made this excuse. In fact, the Bible's full of people who have made this excuse. So one of the first people that I think of in Scripture that was probably the king with this excuse was Moses himself. Anybody ever heard of Moses? Yeah, some of you know the story of Moses. Moses is out in the desert. He's taking care of sheep. He's been out there for 40 years, just kind of minding his own business. God shows up one day in a burning bush. Moses goes over to look at the bush, and what's amazing to him about it is the fact that it's on fire, but it's not being consumed. And so he goes over and he looks at it, and when he gets over there, God begins to talk to him out of this bush. And he says, Moses, I want to commission you for something. There's something that I want you to do. In fact, I want you to go back to Egypt, and I want you to go up to Pharaoh and look him in the face and say, let my people go. And Moses is like, seriously, I don't think so. And he says, listen, I'm not spiritually strong enough to do this. In fact, this long conversation goes on back and forth between him and Moses, or between Moses and God. And Moses just makes excuse after excuse after excuse. But at the heart of every excuse that he makes is this excuse that we're looking at today. God, I'm just not spiritually strong enough. And Moses does what many of us do. When we think about what it looks like, what it means to be spiritually strong, we often think of somebody else. And Moses is like, hey, I'm not your guy, but I know who is. And so he says, my brother Aaron, he's your guy. He's the one that you want to do this. And God's like, no, you're the one that I want to do this. And so Moses doesn't get off with that excuse. And the truth of the matter is we don't get off with it either. So there is something, as I was preparing today, coming into today, I am convinced that there is something that God is asking some of you to do. And you know what it is, but yet you've been making this excuse. Maybe there's a phone call that you're supposed to make, or a conversation that you're supposed to have. Maybe there's a visit that you need to make. Maybe there's something that God's asking you to lead, but you keep making this excuse. Or maybe God just wants you to be a part of a team and volunteer somewhere. But you keep saying to God, listen, I'm just not spiritually strong enough, God. You need to find someone else. As you think about who and what that is, I want to say this. All of us would be willing to do it if it weren't for, back to our statement, this idea of fear. If it weren't for fear, God, I would do it. You see, that's really what we're saying when we make that excuse. If it wasn't for fear, I would, but because I'm fearful, even though I say it's really about not being spiritually strong, we choose not to do it. So here's what I want to do today. And guys, this is true of all of us. All right, so don't feel alone in this. This message is as much for me as it is anybody else, because we've all been there. And if you're not there right now, it's just a matter of time till you end up there. So here's what I want to do this morning. I want to give you three things, three thoughts, three truths about today's topic. They're on the back of your program. If you've got one, let me encourage you to take it out, follow along. Those who are watching online, there's a place there that says notes. You can click on that. You can do the same thing. But I want to give you three thoughts, three truths concerning today's topic. To set up the first one, I want to first of all look at a very popular verse in the Bible that speaks into this. It's found in Joshua chapter 1, verse 9. Many of you probably have heard this verse or something very similar to it. God speaking to Joshua says, have I not commanded you, Joshua, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Now, a lot of people like to use this verse to motivate others to do what God is asking them to do. And sometimes we'll use it even for our own selves when we know that we're getting ready to do something and but we really don't want to do it. And we're like, okay, God commanded me to be strong and courageous. And so I got to be strong and courageous and I'm going to do this thing. And so we'll use that verse to do that. I want to give you a little bit of background on this verse, where it comes from and why God said this to Joshua. So the book of Joshua in the Old Testament, it's the sixth book then, it's kind of a book of transition. Some things begin to change at the very beginning of Joshua. And some of those changes involve a guy named Moses that we've just talked about and this new guy, Joshua. Here's what happened. Moses has died. Moses has been leading the children of Israel for some 40 plus years. And his job was to bring them out of Egypt and bring them into the promised land. But when they got to the promised land, Moses sends some spies in to check it out. These spies come back and they're like, hey, there's no way that we can take this land. There's no way we can defeat these people. There's giants in the land. In fact, all but two of the spies, that was the report they gave. But there were two other spies who were like, no, listen, God is on our side. We can do this. And one of those spies happened to be Joshua. Now, because the people chose to follow the guys who said that you can't go in, God says, listen, this generation of people will not get to go into the promised land because you don't trust me, because you refuse to believe what I'm telling you. He says, all of you, this generation will die. When the next generation, once that generation has died, then the next generation will be allowed to go in. And so Moses has died. And the only two left from that generation are Joshua and a guy named Caleb. And God says to Joshua, Joshua, you're now going to take Moses' place. And you're going to be the one to lead the people into this promised land that I've given them. And so what we really don't know is what was going on with Joshua, because Joshua, like I said, he was one of the spies who was like, listen, we can do this. God is on our side. We've got this. And so in these first 9 verses, 3 different times when God shows up and commissions Joshua to do this, he says to Joshua, do not be afraid, do not be discouraged. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. And so there was something going on with Joshua. Now, what we don't know, was it something that had happened over the last 40 years while they're camped outside, the promised land and waiting to go in? Did he get discouraged? Or maybe, and I happen to think, maybe it was more about what was yet to come. Because this was a huge task that God was giving Joshua to do. Joshua had been Moses' right-hand man for the last 40 years. He had seen everything that God had done in and through Moses and how they'd got to this point. And now Moses isn't there and he's the head guy and he can only imagine what it's going to be like, one, facing the people that he's about to face and have to fight against them with the people that he's got to fight against him. And so maybe it's as much about preparing him for the future as it was. And so God says to him in verse 9, the final time, listen, Joshua, do not be afraid. Have I not commanded you? And then he ends with this last phrase. He says, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Now hold that thought. We're going to take a jump. We're going to jump into the New Testament for just a moment. So like Joshua, when Moses ended, God comes along and commissions Joshua to take Moses' place. In the New Testament, something very similar happens. Jesus dies. And God, through Jesus, chooses someone to take his place, to pick up where he left off. Only that it wasn't just a person, it was a group of people. And so Jesus has died, he was buried, he came back to life, and he spends about 40 days before he ascends into heaven. And during this 40-day period, one of the things that he does is he commissions these people to take his place, to pick up where he left off. At the very end of Matthew's account of the life of Jesus, we find what has now been called the Great Commission, where Jesus commissions people to take his place. Here's what it says in Matthew chapter 28. Then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. So he grabs their attention. He says, listen, I have the permission, I have the authority to commission you to do what I'm about to do. So then he goes on, verse 19, he says, therefore go. Everybody say go. Therefore go and make. Everybody say make. Therefore go and make disciples, to which those people and you and I today, because this commission is just as much for us as it was for them, because this commission was for the people who would become a part of the greatest movement to ever land on planet Earth, and that's the church. And so this commission was for anyone who would place their faith and trust in Jesus Christ. And Jesus says, therefore go and make disciples, to which we've been saying, well, I would, but I'm not spiritually strong enough. This has to be for somebody else to do, not me. You see, some of those in that crowd that day made that excuse. And all throughout history, down to this very day, many of us have been making an excuse to not do what God has called us to do. And that excuse is that for whatever reason, we think we're not spiritually strong enough. So he says, therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And then he ends with this statement, and see if this doesn't sound familiar. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. You see the connection between that and what he told Joshua back in the Old Testament? Joshua, I will be with you everywhere you go. You got this because I'm with you. And then Jesus says, hey, the people that I'm commissioning to take my place, guess what? I will be with you wherever you go. Whatever I ask you to do, I am there with you. Together we have this. So just as Joshua was commanded to go, so are we, with the same promise. God is right there with us, always. So here's the first point that I want to make. This isn't about fear or our abilities. I think it's more about the fear of trusting God. To trust God to do what God is asking us to do, and to believe that he's going to be right there with us. I wrote this in my notes. this lie, this excuse has nothing to do with ability, but it has everything to do with obedience. Everybody say obedience. Let me say this again. This has nothing to do with your ability or my ability, but it has everything to do with obedience. So here's the first point that I want to give you. Obedience is what makes us spiritually strong. Obedience is what makes us spiritually strong. So listen, you can pray, you can read the Bible, you can even memorize scriptures, you can attend small group, you can show up here on Sunday morning and be taught God's word. But none of those things are going to make you spiritually strong. Only obedience to what God is asking us to do makes us spiritually strong. And this is maybe a weak analogy, but you've heard the phrase armchair quarterbacks, right? Anybody in here an armchair quarterback? Man, I'm the best at the game there ever was. I mean, I can sit in my chair on Sunday afternoons and watch games, and if you don't believe me, ask my wife, because sometimes I scare her to death because out of nowhere I'm yelling and screaming and mad, or I'm cheering. But I can tell this quarterback or these other players exactly what they need to do, and if they would just do what I tell them to do, they would win the game. So we've been there. So here's the truth of the matter. Listen, we could memorize the playbook. We could, call the plays. We could hold a football in our hand. But until we get in the game, only then do we have a chance of winning, right? Only when we're in that game and playing do we get the chance to act. And so I keep thinking, that one of these days, and I believe it with all my heart, one of these days the Redskins are going to figure this out and they might actually win a game. But anyway, I digressed. I shouldn't have gone there. So, in all seriousness, this first point, and all that's going to tie together, is this. Obedience, everybody say obedience, is what makes us spiritually strong. Doing what God has commissioned, called, whispered in our ear, whatever phrase you want to use, called us to do. Obedience is what makes us spiritually strong. And so you're thinking, okay, I hear that, and I even get that. But what about my fear? Because my fear is real. And I agree with you. It is real. All right? But you're not the only one. You won't be the last one to experience fear. In fact, fear isn't something that's reserved for just certain people. I think fear is something that we all experience. I think every person in the Bible, I know every person that I read about, whether it was Moses or Aaron or any of the other folks that we're going to talk about this morning, the one thing that we all have in common is fear. This lack of courage sometimes to do what God is asking us to do. Take Gideon, for example. Gideon's a guy that we learn about in the Old Testament. One day Gideon is hiding in a wine press. He's threshing out wheat. This group of people, Gideon was of the tribe of Israel, but this other nation, this other group of people called the Midianites were kicking their butts. I mean, they couldn't do anything that these guys weren't interfering with them. Every time they would plant crops, the Midianites would show up right before the Israelites would harvest and take all of their food. And they were this was just going on and on and on and on. And the Israelites had just become so fearful of these people. And so this one particular day, Gideon is in a wine press. He's hiding in there, threshing out wheat. A wine press, it should be where you're making, wine, but instead he's in there with a little bit of wheat that he's got. We don't know where he got it from, but he's making sure that the Midianites doesn't know he has it, and he's hiding from them. And as he's doing this, God shows up. And he looks at Gideon, and the first thing he says to Gideon is this: "Hey, you, mighty warrior." Now, that's kind of ironic when you read the story because, a warrior, a mighty warrior, the last thing he would be doing is hiding somewhere. He would be out standing up against the people that, you follow me? So he shows up and he's like, "Gideon, hey, you mighty warrior, I want to commission you to do something." He said, "I want you to put a stop to what the Midianites are doing." To which Gideon's like, "God, I hear that, but you got the wrong guy because I'm not spiritually strong enough." And so this conversation, much like the one with Moses, goes back and forth and back and forth. And every time that God would just seem like he just about had Gideon where he wanted him, Gideon would throw out another excuse. And the story goes back and forth. And finally, Gideon is down to, God, well, if it's really you, let's do this little test thing. And so he does this fleece deal with God. And 3 different times he does this. And God meets his needs. And eventually Gideon gives in and he goes on and does what God does. But God asked him to do. But there's something that God said to Gideon that I think is applicable for you and me. And it's found in Judges chapter 6, verse 14. Here's what God said to him. The Lord turned to Gideon and said, go in the strength that you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? He says, go in the strength that you have. Now, how much strength do you think Gideon had at that moment? For hours, maybe even days, he's been making excuses. God, I'm not your guy. I'm not spiritually strong enough. In fact, at one point he says, look, I am the weakest member of my entire tribe. You need to find somebody else who's stronger. To which God says, I don't want anybody else. I want you. And I want you to go in the strength that you have. And so I can only imagine that the only strength that Gideon had was his fear. And so God says, I want you to go in fear then and watch what happens. So here's the second thing, truth. Do it in fear and watch your fear become faith. Do it in fear and watch your fear become faith. So I want to give you an illustration this morning. How many of you were here last week? Remember the illustration I gave you? The cow? Anybody remember the cow? Have you thought about that cow this week? Did you see my post this week of that cow chewing the cud? He was talking to you guys saying, hey, I hope you'll join me. So if you weren't here last week, you have to go back. And it was a great illustration, very impactful. Some of you still remember. Well, I'm going to give you another illustration, and it probably won't be as impactful unless I screw this up and then fall. Then you'll never forget it. But how many of you have been rappelling before? Anybody ever been rappelling? All right, so some of you will get this, and you've experienced this. So I remember years ago, I went rappelling, took some teenagers. We had a couple Navy SEALs who were teaching us how to do this, and it was incredible. But there's this point in rappelling where you have to go in fear. You have to take this first step. And so hopefully this is still tied really good back there, and I'm going to demonstrate this to you for just a second. But there's this point where you're hooked up to the rope. All right, and you throw the rope over, and the guy on the bottom, he's got the rope. But then you have to start leaning out way over the edge. And so I remember Jim was our instructor, and he said, all right, Jeff, you're there. I want you to stand with your feet about halfway off the edge. And now we were 4 stories up. I don't know if you've ever been 4 stories up and look over the side of the building. That's a long ways down, all right, when there's nothing between you but and the ground but air. So he says, listen, I want you to stand on the edge. I want you to put your feet about halfway off and holding dear life to the rope. And he says, now I want you to start leaning back. And so we start leaning back, and he says, keep going, keep going, keep going. And so we're leaning way back over the edge like I am right now. And then he says, all right, you ready? And I'm like, ready for what? He says, take a step. And I'm like, seriously? He goes, no, seriously, take a step. Now, here's what happens. At that moment, if you don't take a step and you keep leaning back as you're leaning back, if you don't take that step, you know what happens to you? You end up upside down hanging on the side of the building. And if you think it's scared looking up, when you're laying upside down on the side of the building looking down, believe me. But here's my point. There's this point where as you're leaning over the side of the building, and this is true even if you're facing forward, all right? So I'm going to try this, and I noticed nobody's stood here today to help catch me, but that's okay. But these guys were nuts. They would demonstrate for us. But he was like, as you're leaning over, there comes a point as you're leaning over where you have to take that first step. If not, especially if you're going down head first or face first, your face is going to be the first thing that hits the side of the building. But he says, as you're leaning over, the key is that first step. Now, when you take that first step, I promise you, you're taking that step in fear. All right? It is one of the scariest things that you've ever done, but it's also one of the most amazing things that you've ever done. And this is where it applies to us today. There's something about doing it in fear. When he said to Gideon, go in the strength you have, go ahead and take that first step. And while we might take it and begin in fear, by the time our foot hits the ground, our fear starts to transform into something called faith. And before you know it, you're experiencing one of the most incredible things you could ever experience, just like rappelling down the side of that building. Guys, when Gideon stepped out in faith and he did what God told him to do, when Moses took that first step, every one of these guys took their first step in fear. But their fear became faith, and their faith became obedience. And at that moment, they became spiritually strong. And this is what will happen for us when we trust God, when we step out, even do it in fear. There's just something about, okay, God, this is all I got. All I got is fear, but I'm going to take this step because you have commanded me, you've commissioned me to do this, and you've promised that you will always be with me. And so if I plant my face in the side of this building, you're going to be there with me, but I'm going to take this step. And as we do, there's something about what happens to our fear at that moment. You don't become fearless, but you do become fearless. And I think this is true of, guys, of all the folks in the Bible. We're not the only one to experience this. They never got to a place where they were fearless, that they never had any fear. I think they became fearless over time. And as we take that step and the next step, over time, we'll become fearless as well, but we never lose that fear. And this is true of all the folks in the Bible, all the people that we hold so dear and think they were so spiritually strong, and we're like, I can't do it because look at those guys, and I don't measure up to them. Take the Apostle Paul for a moment. Paul was an early follower of Christ, incredible church planner. In fact, he went on to write much of the New Testament that you and I have today. But Paul wasn't always a follower of Christ. There was a time where he was anything but that. In fact, he threw people in jail, even had people stoned to death for being a follower of Christ. But one day he has this incredible encounter with Christ, and he himself then becomes a follower. He becomes a church planner, and he becomes this incredible man of faith, and he starts all these churches. He writes much of what we have as the New Testament. But Paul wasn't maybe the biggest giant, as big a giant as we think he was. Paul was commissioned by God to take the gospel of Jesus Christ to a group of people who didn't know God, a group of people who honestly didn't even want to know God or even know that they needed to know God. And he says, this is who I want you to go convince that I'm real and that I love them and that they matter to me and that I sent my son to die for them. And so he goes to this group of people, this people in Corinth, these Gentile people, and I want you to see what happens as he goes. This is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 2. He says, and so it was with me, brothers and sisters, when I came to you, I did not come with eloquence of human wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. He says, listen, I didn't show up and as some seminary teacher and try to teach you everything that there was to know about God and all the different doctrines and all this stuff. He said, that wasn't me. That's not who I was. That's not how I came to you. In fact, he goes on and he says this. He says, for I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. He says, guys, when I showed up, he says, there was only one thing that I wanted you to know. There was only one thing that I wanted to share with you, and that was that Jesus died for you, that you matter to him, that he loves you, and that he came back from the dead to prove all of this to you. He said, that's all I wanted you to know. In fact, what he's really saying, that's all I really had the courage to tell you, which is really all the courage he needed, because look at what he says next. He says, I came to you in what? Weakness. Wait a minute, this is the Apostle Paul. Somebody that we would look at and think, man, if there was anybody who was spiritually strong, it was this guy. But he says, look, I came to you in weakness with great what? Fear and trembling. Paul says, listen, when I showed up, you have no idea how scared I was. You have no idea how hard it was for me to take that first step. He says, but I did it. And he goes on to say, and God used me to lead many of you to faith in his son, Jesus Christ. But that would have never happened if Paul hadn't have taken that first step. So even the great apostle Paul had to deal with his own fear. And so while we would like to lose our fear, I want to offer you that your fear may be your greatest strength. So I'm going to go ahead and give you the third statement, truth, and it's this. If you lose your fear, you will lose your true strength. If you lose your fear, you will lose your true strength. Here's why I say this. In Paul's second letter to this same group of people, all right, so he'd been there years before. He followed up with a letter to remind them of what he did and what took place. And now he follows up with a second letter. And in this second letter, he shares a little bit of his own personal story and some things that are going on in his life. And he says, hey, there was this thing going on in my life, and I was given this thorn in the flesh. Now, we don't know what that thorn was. If you were here a couple weeks ago, we talked a little bit about this. But he says, I was given this thorn in the flesh. And he said, and again, we don't know what it was. Some think that it could have been his eyesight. In one of the letters we read that his eyesight was going bad. Some think that it wasn't anything physically, that maybe it was something more emotionally or mentally going on with him. And maybe it had to do with this fear factor that he's facing and dealing with right now. But he says, I prayed and asked God to relieve me of this 3 different times. God, take away this fear so that I can be more bold for you, so that I can be spiritually strong for you. To which God says, okay, not going to happen. In fact, here's what Paul says happened. He says, but he said to me, God said to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in what? In your weakness. He said, if you want boldness, if you want power, I'll give it to you. But you'll only experience it through your weakness. To which Paul then says this, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness so that Christ's power may rest on me. See, here's what happens when we lose our fear. We begin to trust in ourselves and we stop trusting in God. And God stops working in us and through us because, well, we don't need him anymore. But it's only when we remain faithful and true to what God has called us to do. I love what Paul says next. Here's what he says. He says, for when I am weak, then I am strong. When I am scared to take that next step, that's when I find my greatest strength. Because this strength isn't in me, my strength is in God. And as I step out in faith, in fear, my fear becomes faith, and my faith becomes obedient, and I become spiritually strong in God, and God can use me to do what only God can do at this point. So this is why I say that your fear may be your greatest strength. And it's the last thing, I know, believe me, nobody would like to become fearless more than me when it comes to serving God. But at the same time, I don't want to lose that fear because I know it forces me to trust in God. And I get to experience and see God work in and through my life to help me do things that I would not otherwise be able to do if it weren't for him. And the same is true for you and me. So I want to go back to the phrase that we first put up. If it were not for fear, how would you finish that? If it weren't for fear, I would. Listen, all of us, there's something that all of us have always wanted to do, that we would love to do, but that fear factor keeps standing in our way. There's something that God has specifically asked you to do, commissioned you to do, and you're making excuses. So what if instead of excuses, we change this statement to look more like this? In spite of my fear, I'm going to take that first step. And you know what that step is. That first step is really submitting to God and say, okay, God, I believe you've commissioned, you've called me, you've whispered in my ear, you've showed me that this is what you want me to do. And so God, no more excuses. In spite of my fear, I'm going to go in my fear. and watch you do what only you can do. You see, this is where we'll find our spiritual strength. When we stop negotiating with God about our fear, when we stop negotiating with Him and we take that first step in fear, and that fear then becomes faith, and that faith becomes obedience, and that obedience then makes us spiritually strong in God. But it has to start when we stop negotiating and just say, in spite of my fear, I'm going to, and you fill in that blank. Let me pray for us. Would you pray with me for a moment? Right now, and I go back to the beginning, guys, you already know what it is that God's asking you to do. You've been making excuses for a long time. And fear has kept you from experiencing God's grace, God's truth, and God's power in your life. Today, would you be willing to stop negotiating with God and take that first step, even though you're taking it in fear, in obedience to what God is asking you to do? We're going to listen to a song, and as we listen to this song, I want you to think about what that first step would look like for you. And maybe during this song, you would say, God, today, no more negotiating. I'm going to do this. And here's what I promise you. If you will do this, you will find out just how big our God really is.
We hope this message will help you explore, experience, and express God's grace and truth for your life. If Atlee Church has made a difference in your life, or you have questions about today's message, we'd love to hear from you. Simply email us at stories@atleechurch.org. Check out our website for more information about small groups, upcoming events, and how you can help financially support Atlee Church so that we can continue to share messages like this one. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so that you can receive new podcasts every week. You can also find our podcast on iTunes. Thanks again, and hope to see you next Sunday.